As the sun sets in the rural village of Tholeni, the cattle start rustling uncomfortably as they become aware of something lurking in the bushes. What lurks in the bushes is enough to startle these beautiful beasts. So what chance do sleeping women and children have against what lurks in the dark? Hi everyone, welcome to or welcome back to my channel. The last time we spoke about the case of Sonia Schwartz, where police who are there to protect and serve turn on one another and become deadly. Also, even though the perpetrator was caught literally red-handed, the sentencing handed down was incredibly offensive to the victim and the families left behind. And if you have not seen that, I'll link it up here for you. But for today's case, we are talking about the Monster of Tholeni, who absolutely terrified the women and children from May of 2007 to August of 2012. So let me not yap anymore and let's get into today's case.
Intended for mature audiences only.
Today we are heading to the rural village of Tholeni. This area is known to be quite poverty-stricken, with a lot of its inhabitants unemployed and either live off the land or have to travel long distances for their jobs. This area has had significant deforestation occur, and this happened for very complex reasons, but the impact on the environment has caused a food scarcity and underdevelopment, so it's a really tough area to call home. And before we hop any further into today's case, I do just want to give a slight warning for those who are listening, because this case does involve essay of minors as well as their murder, so just keep that in mind. The Eastern Cape as a province is beautiful. You have the coast, then further inland you have the hills and the mountains. The terrain is mixed and caters for a lot of animals and habitats. Just past Butterworth is the village of Tholeni. At the time of this case, many of those who lived in the village were either unemployed or lived off the land. Some of the only lights were coming from the homes at night. So if you have ever been to the bush or out in the wilderness and all of the lights are off, that is how dark the small village can be at night, except from a few lamps glowing in the homes. So there was so much that could happen in this darkness. Also, in the small village, there is no police station here. The closest one was around 30 kilometers away, so at least a 25-minute drive if you're going pretty fast, so you're pretty much alone. Then, on the 11th of May 2007, a man was waiting for his mom to come and visit him, as she usually did, but he was growing incredibly impatient because his mom wasn't coming through to him, so he thought maybe it's just because she's older. She is 79 years old, so she's maybe just taking a little while. But the longer the hours kind of spread along, the more worried he was getting, because he thought maybe his mom slipped, because it was unlike her not to come to his home on the evening to do whatever they needed to do. So this man then locked up his home, and he then headed towards his 79-year-old mother's home in hopes that he would just find her and maybe she had forgotten. But as he stepped into his mom's home, which was always very neat, he opened the front door and it was just absolute bloodbath. He found his mom lying in bed, absolutely drenched in blood. The police who were first on the scene, actually some of them got ill because of how violent and gruesome the scene was. And in South Africa, there are a lot of violent and gruesome scenes. It is very common, sadly. But for this very small town and what these police had walked into on a 79-year-old lady's home, they were really sickened by it. An autopsy was done, and it was found that the 79-year-old woman was attacked in her bed in the middle of the night. She had been hacked with an axe and murdered. By the footprints, the body, and how the blood had pooled, it looked like whoever did this left after they murdered her, came back, inflicted more wounds with another smaller, sharper weapon, and then after she had passed away. When the community heard, they thought that some random person came into the village and did this to her, because of how absolutely cruel it was. Her time of death, as estimated by the post-mortem, was to be around midnight. And because the surrounds are so rural, there are no CCTV cameras, there's no blood trail, nothing. So her murder quickly went cold. Then, on the 13th of January 2008, a young lady woke up in the middle of the night to a man standing above her in her bedroom. His movements around the bedroom had woken her up, and she woke up to the biggest fright of her life. This man then quickly lunged at her and started grabbing her, pulling her hair, smacking her, beating her, until he then pulled out an axe and started hacking at her. She did try and fight back, but she had just woken up from her sleep. She was in the dark. She was not prepared for this. And sadly, she did lose her life, and she was also raped. The next morning, she was found because her neighbor had walked past on her way to work when she noticed that her front door was open. So she thought that this was quite strange because this was quite a young lady. Why would her front door be wide open, especially so early in the morning? So she kind of just pushed the front door open, and just like the 79-year-old woman's home, everything was drenched in blood. And when police first got there, they did note that yes, there was another murder with an axe. But as we'll get into this case later on, because it is in an area where a lot of people have axes in their homes, be that to chop firewood or whatever else they needed to do with the axe, many people had access to this weapon. So it was something that could have been used, brought from their home, or used from the victim's home, because everybody kind of had one. And even with the second murder, the village did believe that this must have been an outsider because of how cruel it was. So in January of 2009, sadly, as it would become more common throughout this case, we would notice that a lot of the women and children who were victimized, their husbands or their partners seemed to have lived quite far away or worked far away, where they weren't always home with the women and children. And in January of 2009, a woman was asleep with her 2 children in her bedroom, and sadly, because her husband lived quite far away, she wasn't very friendly with a lot of the people in the village. So there were quite a few months where it went unnoticed that her and her children were missing. And sadly, when her husband came home from wherever he was working, he walked into a scene where his family had been absolutely hacked to death. And the village community was absolutely horrified because this was the first case where children had now been murdered. But sadly, there would be nothing that they could do to stop this killing spree. Then, a couple months after the family was found murdered in 2009, Nokwezi Elizabeth Nonguya woke up to a man in her bedroom. He lunged at her, he started hitting her with an axe, and he then raped and murdered her. There were some reports that he also raped her 6-year-old daughter, but this was not confirmed. Sadly, he did murder both mom and daughter that night, and Nokwezi also had a 14-year-old son who tried to fight this man off his sister and his mother, but he too was badly injured, but he did end up surviving. And with Nokwezi's 14-year-old son, it's not clear whether her son was able to identify the perpetrator, which I assume he wasn't able to, or he isn't in the state to relay that information anymore, because this perpetrator was never found that night, even though there was one survivor. So the women in the village were terrified. A lot of the men in the village, like we mentioned earlier, were either working in different provinces, or they were not home at all late at night due to working far away. So they were left completely alone. A lot of the women would sleep with the cattle in hopes that the person wouldn't find them, or the woman would then take turns watching while the other woman slept. But this was not sustainable. But even so, it was a small village, and they thought it was an outsider who was watching them, stalking them, and then killing them. Also, as a side note, nothing was ever stolen in these homes. Someone went into the homes with direct purpose to go in there and either murder or murder and them. And then they just left. And they knew that the women who they were attacking were home alone and that no men were present in the home. And because of this and many other cases that would sadly follow, Tholeni village was named the Village of Death. And a lot of people believed that a curse had been set upon them. But what the residents had also started noticing was that this perpetrator would always attack on very windy nights and generally around midnight. So when windy nights started to pick up, the village residents absolutely went into terror and panic mode. They were terrified every time there was wind. And then again, on the 12th of September 2009, another young lady was and murdered by axe in her own home, and neighbors would discover her body the next morning. But also, because there were so many murders happening in this small village, sadly, a lot of the residents were becoming accustomed to how to act around a crime scene. So when they found or noticed that a neighbor had been murdered, they would go into the home, they would see and identify that their neighbor had been murdered, they are not alive, so they would then step back out, do not touch anything, do not step in the blood, do not tamper with the crime scene, just call the police and leave. Which you might think, oh, we've all watched crime documentaries, we've all seen this, but these are people's sisters, their wives, their loved ones, and they now have to become used to how murder and crime scenes work. It is really bizarre and horrible that these villagers have to go through this. But because the crime scenes were becoming a lot more protected and people were not tampering with them anymore, there was a lot more DNA that was being picked up at the crime scenes, a lot more semen being found on the bed. So the police were now building a DNA identikit that they could hopefully track and find a perpetrator from. The police presence was increasing in the area. They were having more patrols, but because the police station was based 30 minutes away, roughly, or 30 kilometers away, it was difficult for the police to leave their actual station to come here. So they couldn't really stay. There was a police vehicle every now and then, but they would have to leave. And when they left, the darkness would then return. So on the 8th of April 2010, this crime was just absolutely putrid and violent. But an older lady who was looking after her two grandchildren as their parents were working in the city, she had a sleepover with her grandchildren that night, and the three of them hopped into bed like they did so many times before. And they all went to sleep thinking nothing of the windy night outside. The neighbors then awoke to the smell of smoke and sounds of screaming. And when they looked outside their windows, the home where the grandmother and her two granddaughters were sleeping in was engulfed in flames. The villagers did end up putting the flames out by the time any type of rescue came to the village, but by the time that they did this, it was way too late and the home was pretty much rubble by then. And although the bodies were burnt, the police were able to identify clearly that hack wounds were visible on the bones, especially because the axe was used so violently, it had gone straight through bones. So police could easily identify that an axe type of weapon had been used. So it now looks like the man who had been doing this was trying to hide his tracks. Maybe he heard that DNA was being collected and he was trying a different type of modus operandi. But he was getting incredibly brave because not only a few days after the neighbors had found this home ablaze with three bodies, and including two children, by the way, inside this home, a few days after this, he struck again. Non-Police Gamba, who was at home alone because her husband had been working in a different province, she was at home with her young daughter Siatanda, and once again, a man crept into their house in the middle of the night in complete darkness, and he attacked them. It seems like he aimed for the young child this time because there were reports that Siatanda was the one who was between the two of them, but both of them were murdered with the axe as well. So I do just want to point out that, remember, this started in 2007. It is now 2010. 3 years after this has started, and police are no closer to finding out who murdered so many residents in this village. And in 2010 was the FIFA Football World Cup, or the Soccer World Cup, and we hosted it in South Africa. And it was a really great time for a lot of people. Allegedly, some of the crime went down, but take that with a grain of salt. Because even though our country was building up to this massive event that was happening in 2010, in the village in Tholeni, people were being murdered, and police now either being pressurized to make sure that these don't end up in headlines with all these footballers and very important people coming to South Africa. The police now decided to rain down on Tholeni and figure out what was happening. So in May of 2010, roughly around a month before the first kickoff, I think in June of 2010, before the Football World Cup started, so in May, a huge convoy of police drove into Tholeni and told all the villagers, all the men, to line up and we're going to take all of your DNA. It was not mandatory, but if you don't kind of do it, you kind of look very suspicious. So anyone aged 16 and over, get your butts into the line and we're going to start swabbing. So while a lot of the men were in the queue getting their swabs for the DNA, a lot of the women were being questioned by female police officers as well, just to kind of see if they knew anything, if they had remembered anything. And the women at first were very helpful, but the more they were being asked, the more irritated they kind of started getting. They did understand why the police wanted to ask these questions, but they said that the only women who knew anything were the ones who were being murdered, because we didn't know what was happening in the night. We think that it's someone watching us, stalking us, knowing who doesn't have men in the village at the time, and we don't know who it is. But police just kept saying, we understand that, but maybe someone saw anything, noticed anything, but no one knows anything. So this next part I find incredibly frustrating, because what we'll find out later is that the serial killer that we're talking about was the person in this group that were excluded from taking DNA samples at the time. So basically, in South Africa, we have our ID cards or our ID books, And because this person didn't have, or this group of people, it ended up being quite a few, but because they didn't have a form of ID or drivers or any form of ID number on them, the police told them to not come for a DNA test because they didn't really want to go through the process of having no form of identity with this DNA sample. And I do understand that it is a lot more admin because you have this DNA sample with no form of identification, but you could have taken their name down, maybe a picture, and posted it on the DNA kit. We don't know. But they didn't take anything, and they let these group of men go. And in that group was our serial killer. And also, I find it incredibly frustrating because as South Africans, we know that so many of our people are left in poverty, and this may be sometimes quite a political issue, but so many of our people do not have access to basic infrastructure. And having your birth certificate or your ID card is something that every South African should have available to them. So when people live in really rural areas, it is incredibly difficult for them to get from a very rural area, travel hundreds of kilometers to get to a home affairs. So I understand why they don't have IDs, but the police should have made a plan knowing that so many South Africans do not have access to basic needs. But that is another rant for another day. Let me not get flustered with that. But now the DNA was taken, the swabs were taken, the women were asked questions, and the residents of the village of Tholeni watched the police drive away in their convoy. And sadly, 2 weeks after the police left, our serial killer would strike again. Snazel Pamela Mbeki was sleeping at home with her 2 grandchildren when she was attacked. However, Snazel's grandchildren were aged 6 and 1.5 years old. And our killer was getting incredibly brazen because Snazel was not alone at home. She wasn't sleeping in her bed without people still in the home. She had other people and other family members sleeping in the room right next door. But he was getting very good, clearly, at being able to get into a home incredibly quiet and be able to kill multiple people without a single peep from the victims. So when this family woke up, they not only lost Snazel, their grandmother, but they lost someone's 2 children as well, a 6-year-old and a 1.5-year-old. The South African Police Services, or SAPS, only started reporting this to the media after Snazel and her family had been murdered. And only then did SAPS report that there's a serial killer running around. Aaron Hanisa was the police officer who was assigned, or the detective who was assigned to this case in order to solve, and Aaron did issue a 250,000 Rand fine for any information to come forward that would lead to an arrest, but that money was never used. So because of all this media coverage, because people were now talking about it a lot more, the serial killer decided, maybe I shouldn't go around killing people right now. It seems very hot and heated. Let me lay low a little bit and wait for the dust to settle. So he would. And in 2012, he would strike again. And as a side note, the reason that the village of Tholeni was also labeled the village of death is because of another murder that took place in 2009. So remember, this serial killer started murdering in 2007, but at the same time that these other murders were happening in 2009, somebody else, another 2 men, were accused of murdering a woman and raping her, but murdering her with an axe. They were eventually caught because they started murdering other people who they assumed may have noticed or witnessed this murder occurring. So they were eventually caught. But remember this piece of information about these axe murderers. We'll get back to them later. But in 2012, the serial killer would strike again. And remember, we mentioned that a lot of women were taking shifts to let some women sleep and some women would stay awake. Some other women would also sleep with cattle in order to avoid sleeping in their homes so that they wouldn't be murdered. But this was, like we said, not sustainable. So they had to eventually go back home. Their husbands would sometimes return home, but they would have to leave. So it was very chaotic and disruptive for the women of the village. But the women were starting to go back home because it had been over a year now. There was this false sense that things were going to be okay. But no, in May of 2012, the wind was rustling through the village of Tholeni, and a young woman woke up to a man crawling on top of her with an axe in his hand. And what must have gone through these women's mind knowing that there's a serial killer going around? You think you're okay, and then you are woken up with exactly the horror that you've been hearing about in the village, and now he's on top of you trying to kill you. And I just really feel bad for a lot of the women and the terror that was going through this village. But sadly, she was and murdered, and she too had young children in her home. And the serial killer would now take his youngest victim's life, who was only a year and 4 months old. And I assume that he is murdering the 13-year-old children or those who are able to speak because he assumes that they would be able to identify him. But I do not have children, and I'm not sure the age development or the years that children are able to speak. But I don't think that a year and 4-month-year-old baby would be able to identify and clearly articulate that this was the person who murdered me if they were asked that type of question. I don't even think that they can speak very well at that age. So why he was murdering a 1 year, 4-month-old or 1.5-year-old child, we do not know. Then, on the 11th of August 2012, a young lady named Mpumzile was in her home. It was midnight and it was windy. This man then broke into her home. However, Mpumzile was woken up and she heard him, and she got up, and there was an absolute ruckus in this home. She really did fight for her life. She fought really hard, but sadly he was the one with an axe, and he just kept hacking away at her, and eventually Mpumzile came to her injuries and he did end up murdering her. But they really struggled for a while, and this is where he made quite a big mistake, because when he left, he forgot his shoe. So when police were called and they came to the crime scene, not only did they have DNA evidence, but they also had the shoe. And when I first read about the shoe being used as a form to identify the perpetrator, in my head, the first thing I thought about was like, are police going to go around like Cinderella and trying to put the shoe on all the men in the village? Obviously not, but that's the first thing that popped into my head. So all of the DNA was taken, the shoe was taken, and the police then headed off back to the lab to try and have a look at this. But the very next day, the police came back to the village, not because they were looking at anything with the serial killer, but they were there for a different reason. And the reason was because someone had been murdered in a village next door, and they wanted to talk to a man named Siyabonga Mabai. And he had previously been arrested for murder, but was out on parole. And he just happened to live in the village of Tholeni. So police wanted to sit down and have a chat with him. And when they arrived in the village, the police asked where they could find the Mbai family. And the village then pointed to their home, but they said that Siyabonga did not live there at the moment. Only his younger brother. So just to quickly interject again, but the police officer who had come to the village the day before was present, or was the police officer who bagged the shoe. But he was close enough in this case that he knows exactly what the shoe looks like that was left the night before in the murder, and he is able to visualize the shoe. He was present, and he is also the police officer now looking for Siyabonga. So now the police officer is now heading towards this door of the Mbai family, and he knocks on the door. No one answers. So then he just walks in. He just opens the door and walks straight in. And as he walks in, he notices a mattress on the floor. And on this mattress is Bulelani, and he is fast asleep. Lights out, completely knocked out. He is really in a deep sleep. So this police officer is about to wake up and shake Bulelani, but then he looks down and he notices that he only has one shoe on. So instead of being nice and trying to sweetly wake up Bulelani, the police officers kind of grab him and pull him up, but the police absolutely dragged him out of bed, slapped handcuffs on him, and he was arrested and taken straight to the police station on the same day. 39-year-old Bulelani Mbai was arrested and taken into police station. DNA was taken and they had an immediate hit. Bulelani seemed to be really relieved in the way that police had taken him. He felt like he needed to get everything off of his chest, and he confessed to everything that he did. He even led police to another body that was in a field between his village and a neighboring village, where he had then taken and murdered a young woman. Bulelani said that he was just passing through the village, nothing was on his mind, and then he noticed this young woman. He saw her, he watched her, he then walked up behind her, grabbed her, pulled her into a nearby village, and then murdered her and just left her, knowing that her family would look for her, they would never find her until he was the one who pointed her body out to the police when he confessed all of his things that he had done. And this young lady would be his 20th victim. So when the news broke that the stranger the village assumed they were in fear from was actually someone they knew and spoke to often, was actually Bulelani, it was shocking to them, and it was a monster they never saw coming. Bulelani was a boy who arrived in Tholeni village to live with his grandmother, as his mom had passed away when he was around 12 or 13 years old, and his father passed away a year later. So a young orphan boy had to rely on his siblings to help him, but they were kids themselves, so they really struggled. They really struggled to survive. And Bulelani then relied on a life of crime, and he was arrested in his 20s and spent 3 years in Polesmoor prison for smoking and distributing weed. He would then eventually permanently reside in the village of Tholeni and take up carpentry, where he would then make things for the villagers and also sell to the residents who lived in his village. He was described as an isolated and quiet person, and he would very much prefer to be on his own. So police then took Bulelani back to the village, and they were quite worried about what the villagers would do or the residents would do in the village, because they thought that there might be some kind of mob justice, because having the perpetrator who admitted everything, who admitted to conflicting these horrible crimes on these women and children, having him so close back in your village, they were really worried about what the people would do. So police instructed Bulelani to go back to the village and point out all the houses where he had murdered people. And he was surrounded by police in riot shields, and they had helmets and they had batons with them. And so they were going to make sure that no one was coming near Bulelani. And this description really stuck with me, because you have someone who murdered your mother, your sister, your best friend, and here he is centimeters away from you, where you can't grab him and do what you really want to do to him, where he is now being protected by police in order to bring justice back to the victims who police couldn't protect. But once the pointing out was done, Bulelani then was put back into the back of the police vehicle and taken back to the police station. He was also then taken for a psychiatric assessment, and at first he was deemed to be unfit for trial, or there was kind of a humming and hawing about whether he is fit or not, and they were unclear about that. But then he said he's happy to go back again, and he did, and he was deemed fit to go back to trial, and so he did. And on the 27th of August 2013, his trial started. In trial, he was charged with 20 counts of murder, 9 counts of housebreaking, and 6 counts of rape. And he ended up pleading guilty. Bulelani had no reaction to the crying parents, sisters, siblings, mothers of those who had been murdered, or any of the details when it was being read out in court. The only time Bulelani would ever have a reaction or counter anything was when he was asked about the rapes. He would say that he was possessed by an evil spirit, and that's why he did that to the elderly woman. Then, on the 4th of September 2013, the court filled as Bulelani was led in for his sentencing. He was given 25 life sentences, and he will never see the outside of a prison wall for the rest of his life. Now, before we end, I do want to point out a few theories about this case, and there were a few theories that Bulelani didn't act alone. There were some, circumstances in court where he would often say, we did this, we came in, we committed these crimes. And even the interpreter in the trial said that he used this and it wasn't a mistake, but they're not sure if that's just how he spoke or why he always said we, but it was a constant we, never I. Some people think it's a way that he disassociates from it and saying, oh, it was we, so it's not just me, I know I did this and I was the one. If it's we, it's less emphasis on me. But a lot of people believe that the we in the situation is that someone else was part of this crime. And remember that other crime that happened in 2009 where 2 people were arrested. Wow. One of the people who were arrested for these murders, and that person was also related to Bulelani. Their relation is unclear, but they had the same surname. So some people believe that Bulelani did this with another family member in the beginning, and then he branched off. But there is no physical evidence. There's no other DNA present in any of these other murders relating to another male who could have done the crimes. There's no other footprints in the blood pattern on the floor. so it's unlikely, but the constant use of we, him being able to silence so many victims all at once is difficult, especially when you have two teenagers and an adult present in the room. It is difficult. How did he manage to do that? Maybe he just got really good at it, which is also another really terrifying thought. But how was he able to murder so many people at once? Do you think that there was more than one perpetrator involved in the crimes? But the village has to heal. They have painted a lot of their homes very beautiful and vibrant colors, but in between some of these beautiful and vibrant homes are ones that are derelict, that are empty, and that are crumbling as the land reclaims them. Lights were also put up in the village of Tholeni around certain areas so that there could be some form of light in the night, but of course it was not maintained. So a lot of these massive spotlights have now gone out, plunging this village into darkness once again. And sadly, there were cases of other people being murdered in the village, not in the same way that Bulelani had done, in other ways, for other reasons. But the murders do continue, and the villagers wonder if that curse is still there and why evil continues to land over the village of Tholeni. Let me know what you think of this case down below. It was really quite a hectic one to go through. I hope that you all have a great weekend further. Please stay safe out there, and I'll see you again next time. Bye.